Today we will explore one of the most critical regulatory submissions in pharmaceutical development, the Investigational New Drug (IND) application. The IND represents a pivotal milestone in drug development. It is the gateway that allows a sponsor to begin testing an experimental drug in human subjects within the United States. Without an effective IND, no clinical trial involving an unapproved drug can legally proceed. This lecture will cover the complete IND framework, including the regulatory basis under 21 CFR 312, the different categories and types of INDs, the required forms and content, the submission process through the FDA's Electronic Submissions Gateway, lifecycle management requirements, and FDA's role in reviewing INDs. By the end of this session, you will understand how INDs fit within the broader eCTD framework we've been studying, and you'll be prepared to work on IND submissions in a regulatory affairs role. Let's begin with the fundamentals. This slide provides our roadmap for today's comprehensive lecture on investigational new drug applications. We'll begin with IND basics, establishing the fundamental purpose and regulatory framework that governs investigational drug testing in the United States. Understanding why INDs exist is essential before diving into the mechanics. Next, we'll examine IND categories and types, distinguishing between commercial and research INDs, and understanding the three types: investigator INDs, emergency use INDs, and treatment INDs. The section on guidance documents will highlight the key FDA guidance that supports IND preparation, including the primary guidance document and the comprehensive table of contents that maps regulatory requirements to eCTD structure. The setup process covers the practical steps: requesting an IND number, establishing electronic submissions gateway connectivity, and pre-IND consultation opportunities. Forms and content addresses the required FDA forms, 1571, 1572, 3674, and the three core content areas: non-clinical data, manufacturing information, and clinical protocols. Lifecycle management explains how to maintain an active IND through amendments, safety reports, and annual reports throughout clinical development. Finally, we'll discuss FDA's review process, timeline, and possible outcomes, including the may proceed letter and clinical holds. We now begin the first major section of our lecture, IND basics. This foundational section will establish the conceptual framework for understanding why INDs exist, when they are required, and how they fit into the overall drug development timeline. The IND is not simply a form or a filing. It represents a comprehensive dossier of information that allows the FDA to make a determination about whether an investigational drug is reasonably safe for initial human testing. This safety-focused review is distinct from the efficacy-focused review that occurs during NDA evaluation. Understanding the historical and regulatory context of INDs will help you appreciate why certain information is required and how to prepare IND submissions that facilitate efficient FDA review. Let's explore the preclinical foundation that supports every IND. Before an IND can be submitted, substantial non-clinical work must be completed to justify human testing. The three primary goals of non-clinical development are displayed on this slide. First, ADME studies absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion characterize how the drug behaves in biological systems. These studies confirm that the drug candidate binds to its intended target with appropriate affinity and specificity. Understanding the pharmacokinetic profile is essential for designing human dosing regimens. Second, toxicity studies establish the safety profile. These studies are conducted in at least 2 animal species, typically a rodent, rat or mouse, and a non-rodent, dog or primate, to identify potential adverse effects before human exposure. The studies must be conducted under good laboratory practice, GLP, conditions. Third, pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies help predict whether the drug has a reasonable chance of demonstrating efficacy in humans. These studies establish the relationship between drug concentration and pharmacological effect. Critically, the non-clinical data package provides the scientific rationale for 1. Selecting the starting dose in first-in-human studies, typically based on the no observed adverse effect level (NOAEL) in animals with appropriate safety margins, 2. Identifying the safe dose range for escalation, and 3. Establishing parameters for monitoring subjects for potential adverse effects during clinical trials. Without adequate non-clinical data, an IND cannot proceed. This represents a fundamental patient safety consideration. This slide illustrates the comprehensive timeline of non-clinical studies and their relationship to clinical development milestones, the IND and ultimately the NDA. Before IND submission, two categories of studies must be completed. Exploratory studies are typically non-GLP and serve to characterize the drug candidate early in development. These include initial pharmacokinetic assessments, short-term dose escalation toxicology studies, typically 2 weeks, preliminary genotoxicity screening, in vitro safety pharmacology evaluations, particularly cardiovascular, respiratory, and CNS effects, and efficacy studies in disease models. GLP studies are the pivotal non-clinical studies that will be submitted in the IND. These require strict adherence to good laboratory practice regulations, 21 CFR Part 58. Key GLP studies include repeat dose toxicology studies of at least 4 weeks duration in 2 species, rodent and non-rodent, complete genotoxicity battery, in vitro and in vivo, toxicokinetic analysis to support dose selection, comprehensive safety pharmacology core battery, female fertility and teratology studies if women of childbearing potential will be enrolled, and ADME characterization. Importantly, non-clinical work continues in parallel with clinical development. As clinical trials extend in duration, correspondingly longer toxicology studies are required. For Phase 3 trials and NDA submission, 6-month rodent and 9-month non-rodent chronic toxicity studies are typically required. Carcinogenicity studies, 2-year rodent bioassays, are completed during Phase 3. The source cited is from a 2016 publication on non-clinical studies in drug development, which provides an excellent overview of this integrated approach to preclinical and clinical development. This slide contextualizes the IND submission within the complete drug development lifecycle and highlights the various data standards that apply at each stage. The IND submission marks the critical transition from the discovery phase to the investigational phase. This is the point at which regulatory oversight by FDA intensifies, as the product will now be tested in human subjects. Understanding the data standards hierarchy is essential for regulatory professionals. Multiple standards apply to IND submissions. eCTD, Electronic Common Technical Document, the format standard for organizing and submitting the IND dossier electronically. All INDs submitted to FDA must be in eCTD format. SEND, standard for exchange of non-clinical data, the standard for submitting non-clinical study data in a structured, machine-readable format. SEND datasets enable FDA reviewers to analyze toxicology data efficiently. SDTM, Study Data Tabulation Model, the standard for clinical study data tabulation. SDTM formatted datasets are submitted for clinical studies. ADAM, Analysis Data Model, the standard for analysis datasets derived from SDTM data. As shown in the diagram, these data standards continue to apply throughout the investigational phase, all 3 phases of clinical trials, through the application review phase, NDA/BLA submission, and into post-market surveillance. The IND represented in green in the diagram is your entry point into this regulated environment. Once the IND is active, the sponsor assumes significant regulatory obligations that continue throughout development. This slide emphasizes the fundamental purpose of the IND from the sponsor's perspective during preclinical development. The sponsor's primary objective is to answer 2 essential questions before proceeding to human testing. Is this investigational product reasonably safe for initial use in humans? And does it exhibit pharmacological activity that justifies the investment of further development? Reasonably safe is a relative term in this context. For a drug treating a fatal disease with no alternatives, greater risk may be acceptable than for a drug treating a minor condition. The risk-benefit calculus is integral to IND evaluation. When a company identifies a promising drug candidate, the entire preclinical program is designed to support these determinations. The CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls work ensures a consistent, well-characterized product. The pharmacology studies demonstrate the desired mechanism and effect. The toxicology studies identify potential risks and establish safe dose ranges. It's important to understand that the IND is fundamentally a safety document. At this stage, efficacy is not being evaluated by FDA, that assessment comes later during NDA review. The FDA's role with the IND is to ensure that human subjects in clinical trials will not be exposed to unreasonable and significant risk. This safety-first philosophy has its roots in historical tragedies, particularly the thalidomide disaster of the early 1960s, which led to the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment requiring FDA review before human testing could begin. The IND process exists to protect clinical trial participants. This slide introduces the formal regulatory framework for INDs, specifically 21 CFR Part 312, Investigational New Drug Application. The IND acronym stands for Investigational New Drug Application, though colloquially it's often shortened to just IND. This is the regulatory mechanism that governs clinical testing of unapproved drugs in the United States. 21 CFR Part 312 is the foundational regulation that every regulatory affairs professional must know intimately. This regulation defines who may submit an IND, sponsors and sponsor investigators, what information is required, how the FDA reviews INDs, what ongoing obligations the sponsor has, and the circumstances under which FDA can place an IND on clinical hold. The quoted language from the regulation captures the essential legal effect of an IND. Under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, drugs must be approved before they can be legally shipped in interstate commerce. An effective IND creates a specific exemption from this requirement, but only for the purpose of conducting clinical investigations. This exemption is critical because clinical trials require shipping investigational drug from manufacturing sites to clinical trial sites, which typically involves interstate commerce. Without the IND exemption, this would be illegal. It's important to note that the IND is specific to the United States. Other countries have their own mechanisms, the clinical trial application, CTA, in Europe, for example. If a sponsor wishes to conduct clinical trials in multiple countries, separate applications may be required in each jurisdiction, though ICH harmonization has created significant alignment in requirements. This slide elaborates on the legal basis for the IND requirement and introduces the concept that INDs serve multiple purposes beyond the primary exemption function. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FDNC Act, originally enacted in 1938 and significantly amended in 1962, establishes the requirement that drugs must have an approved marketing application, like an NDA or BLA, before they can be transported across state lines. This is the fundamental drug approval requirement in U.S. law. However, this creates an obvious problem. How can drugs be tested in clinical trials if they cannot be legally shipped before approval? The answer is the IND exemption. The sponsor must formally seek this exemption by submitting an IND to FDA. Once an IND is in effect, either because 30 days have passed without FDA objection, or because FDA has issued a study may proceed letter, the sponsor is legally authorized to ship the investigational drug across state lines and to import it from foreign countries for the purpose of clinical investigation. The highlighted point that the IND serves many purposes beyond this primary exemption is important to understand. The IND also serves as 1. The formal regulatory file that documents the development program. 2. The mechanism for FDA communication and feedback throughout development. 3. The framework for safety surveillance during development. 4. The basis for milestone meetings, end of Phase 1, end of Phase 2, pre-NDA. 5. A repository of information that will eventually support NDA/BLA submission. Think of the IND not just as a submission, but as an ongoing regulatory relationship with FDA throughout the investigational phase of development. This slide specifies the circumstances under which an IND is required. These 5 scenarios capture when FDA oversight of clinical investigation is mandatory. First, a new chemical entity, NC, any drug that has never been approved for any use always requires an IND. This is the most straightforward case. The drug has no regulatory history in the US, so FDA must review available safety data before human testing can proceed. Second, approved drugs being studied for new indications require an IND. Even if a drug is FDA approved for one condition, say, hypertension, studying it for a different condition, say, heart failure, requires an IND because the risk-benefit assessment may differ for the new patient population. Third, new dosage forms require an IND. A drug approved as an oral tablet being developed as an injectable would require a new IND because the pharmacokinetics, and therefore the safety profile, may be significantly different. Fourth, new dosage levels require an IND. If studying doses significantly higher than those in the approved labeling, the safety database may not be adequate, necessitating FDA review. Fifth, combination products involving an unapproved drug require an IND. Even if one component is approved, the combination introduces new safety considerations. There are some circumstances where an IND is not required, for example, investigator-initiated studies of marketed drugs used within the approved labeling, conducted by practitioners not intending to submit data to FDA for labeling changes. However, even these studies require IRB approval and informed consent. When in doubt, consulting with FDA is advisable. The agency can provide guidance on IND requirements through pre-IND meetings or informal communications.